In the heart of the wilderness, survival hangs by a thread where nature's beauty masks its ferocity. From British Columbia's snow-dusted forests to the Canadian Rockies, 6 harrowing tales reveal the primal struggle between humans and the wild. Join us as we explore these chilling encounters with bears. Did these individuals survive, or did the wilderness claim them? The forest of British Columbia stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of towering firs and cedars cloaked in the quiet weight of winter's first natural snowfall. Each tree stood like a sentinel, their branches heavy with pristine white, creating an almost sacred stillness. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind weaving between the trunks and the faint rustle of snow dislodged from the canopy. It was a wilderness both beautiful and forbidding, where isolation pressed in on the senses like the cold. Jack, a 24-year-old logger with a wiry frame and a streak of stubborn independence, had chosen this isolation deliberately. His battered camper sat parked near the logging site, a reasonable distance away from the bustling main camp. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could decompress from the day's grueling work without the distractions of human company. Here, surrounded by the vast, untamed forest, he felt a mix of reverence and unease, a tension that kept him on edge even as it soothed him. That day had been particularly punishing, and hours of felling trees had left Jack's muscles aching, his hands vibrating long after he'd set down the chainsaw. The work was grueling, demanding precision and strength, but Jack thrived on the challenge. By the time evening rolled in, he was too exhausted to do more than heat a can of chili on his portable stove. He ate quickly, the warm meal barely registering against the cold seeping into the camper. When he finished, he tossed the pot into the sink, leaving it for tomorrow. He crawled into his narrow cot, pulling a thick woolen blanket up to his chin as the temperature outside plummeted. Snowflakes tapped softly against the camper's windows, a rhythmic lullaby that soon sent him into a deep sleep. The night was heavy with silence until a metallic groan jolted Jack awake. Disoriented, he sat up, his breath visible in the icy air. For a moment, he thought he'd dreamed it. Then it came again, louder, a screech of metal straining under pressure. The sound sent a cold spike of fear through him. Something, or someone, was outside. Straining to listen, he caught the faint huffing and snuffling of an animal, the sound too significant to dismiss. His heart hammered in his chest as the realization dawned. A predator was investigating his camper. The next sound was unmistakable. A massive force slammed against the door, shaking the camper violently. Jack scrambled to his feet, the cot creaking beneath him. Another blow followed, the hinges shrieking under the strain. The door bent inward, its frame splintering with a sharp crack. Before Jack could react, it gave way entirely, crashing to the floor in a burst of noise and cold air. In the doorway stood a grizzly bear, its enormous form framed by the swirling snow. Its fur was dusted with white, its breath steaming in the freezing air, and its eyes gleamed with primal hunger. The bear stepped inside, its bulk making the camper's interior feel impossibly cramped. The stench of the animal filled the space. The bear sniffed the air, its massive head swiveling toward the sink, where the remnants of chili lingered in the unwashed pot. It advanced, knocking over a chair with a casual swipe of its paw. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Jack's instincts screamed at him to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The camper's layout boxed him in. The table and sink were on one side, the cot on the other. His eyes darted to the fire extinguisher mounted near the stove, a potential lifeline. But before he could move, the bear shifted its focus to him. Its gaze locked onto him, and in a terrifying instant, it lunged. The bear's weight crashed into Jack, slamming him against the wall. Pain exploded in his leg as its claws tore through his jeans, ripping flesh with horrifying ease. The sharp tang of blood filled the air, mingling with the animal's musk. Jack gasped, his vision blurring from the shock and the searing pain. Desperation surged through him, overriding the agony. His hand groped for anything within reach, and his fingers closed around the fire extinguisher's cold metal handle. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jack wrenched the extinguisher free from its mount and aimed it at the bear's face. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing a torrent of white foam. The cloud engulfed the bear's head, stinging its eyes and nose. The animal reared back with a furious roar, its claws slashing wildly as it shook its head, trying to rid itself of the suffocating spray. The momentary distraction was all Jack needed. Ignoring the fire in his leg, he dragged himself toward the window. The camper groaned under his movements. He shoved the glass pane open and pulled himself through, landing awkwardly in the snow. The freezing air hit him like a physical blow, but he welcomed it. Crawling through the snow, he put as much distance as he could between himself and the camper. Behind him, the bear's enraged roars filled the night, mingling with the creak of the camper as it shifted under the animal's weight. The forest loomed around him, its shadows deep and unfriendly. Jack's breaths came in ragged gasps as he dragged his injured leg through the snow, leaving a faint trail of blood on the pristine white surface. His clothes were soaked, the cold seeping into his bones, but he pushed forward. In the distance, the faint glow of his colleagues' campsite lights flickered through the trees, a fragile beacon of hope. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of snow, darkness, and distant light. The bear's roars grew fainter, replaced by the sound of his labored breathing and the crunch of snow beneath him. Minutes stretched into an eternity before he finally reached the campsite. Collapsing near the central fire pit, he barely registered the warmth of the flames before his world went black. Jack awoke in a hospital bed, his leg heavily bandaged and his body aching in ways he hadn't thought possible. The doctors told him he'd lost a significant amount of blood but would recover. His colleagues had found him unconscious by the fire, following his blood trail back to the shattered remains of his camper. The bear, they speculated, had retreated into the woods once the camper offered nothing more to scavenge. The scars on Jack's leg were jagged reminders of the encounter, a permanent testament to his survival. Yet, as the weeks passed and his wounds healed, he felt an inexplicable pull back to the wilderness. The forest that had nearly killed him still held its magnetic allure, its beauty undiminished by the danger it posed. The night in a wilderness park in Montana's Rocky Mountains was crisp and clear, the vast expanse of stars glittering like scattered jewels above the Johanssons' campsite. The family of four had settled into their wilderness routine, savoring the calm after an invigorating day of hiking. The soft crackle of their campfire mingled with the occasional chirp of crickets, creating a symphony of serenity. The air carried the distinct blend of campfire smoke and roasted marshmallows as Eric Johansson, a sturdy man in his late 40s, tended the flames. His wife, Karen, and their two children, Clara and Ben, sat nearby, laughing as they competed to craft the perfect golden marshmallow. At first, the bear was just a shadow, a dark, lumbering figure emerging from the edge of the forest. Eric noticed it before anyone else. His easy smile vanished as he gestured silently for his family to stop talking. The black bear, though not as fearsome as a grizzly, was still a powerful presence, its size alone enough to command caution. It hesitated just beyond the campsite, sniffing the air with deliberate intent, drawn to the tempting aroma of their food. The firelight caught the gleam of its eyes as it took a step closer. Eric rose slowly, every muscle in his body tensed. He had read about encounters like this and knew that more often than not, bears could be frightened away without incident. Still, the sight of the animal filled him with a primal unease. He waved his arms and shouted, clapping his hands to appear larger and more threatening. Karen, her voice trembling, joined in, urging Clara and Ben to move toward the car parked a short distance away. But the bear didn't back down. Its ears flattened against its head, and it lowered its massive body into a posture Eric recognized immediately as aggression. His heart pounded as he grabbed a metal pan from the camp table, banging it loudly. The sharp clanging echoed through the still night, but the bear only grew more agitated. A low growl rumbled from its throat as it advanced another step. Then it charged. The bear crossed the campsite with shocking speed, its earlier lumbering pace replaced by an explosion of raw power. Eric barely had time to react before the animal slammed into him, knocking him to the ground with its immense weight. "Run!" he shouted, his voice raw with urgency. Karen grabbed the children and bolted for the car, their screams cutting through the night. The bear wasted no time. Its claws raked across Eric's shoulder in a brutal swipe. The thick fabric of his jacket shredded like paper, and hot pain flared as its claws sank into his flesh. Adrenaline coursed through him, dulling the agony enough to let him kick out at the bear, but its sheer mass pinned him down. When the bear's jaws clamped onto his arm, the sickening crunch of bone was drowned out by its feral snarls. The pain was overwhelming, but Eric's survival instincts kicked in. His free hand groped blindly until his fingers found the metal pan he'd dropped. With every ounce of strength he had, he swung it at the bear's head. The blow landed with a dull clang, causing the bear to recoil momentarily. Eric used the brief reprieve to struggle, but the strike seemed only to enrage the animal further. It roared, a sound that reverberated through the forest, and charged at him again with renewed ferocity. Its claws tore into his torso, the thick fabric of his shirt offering no resistance. Deep, jagged gashes left his skin exposed to the freezing night air, and blood soaked the ground beneath him. The pain was relentless, but Eric refused to give in. He twisted and struggled, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his body. The bear shifted its weight, its jaws finding his thigh. Eric screamed, the sound raw and guttural, as the animal's teeth sank into muscle and bone. His vision blurred, and his strength ebbed with every passing second. The campsite, once filled with laughter and light, was now a scene of chaos. Blood stained the snow-dusted ground, steaming in the cold air. The fire flickered on, indifferent to the violence, casting eerie shadows on the carnage. Eric's breaths grew labored, his body weakening under the relentless assault. Every instinct told him to keep fighting, but his limbs felt leaden, the life draining out of him. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The bear paused, its growls subsiding into deep, heavy breaths. It stood over Eric's broken body, sniffing the air as though deciding whether to continue. Eric lay still, his vision narrowing, his consciousness slipping away. Finally, with a huff, the bear turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness as silently as it had arrived. The campsite was left in ruins, a stark tableau of survival and loss. Eric's blood stained the ground, mingling with the scattered remains of their belongings. The faint sweetness of roasted marshmallows lingered in the air, a haunting contrast to the scene of devastation. Hours later, the distant growl of an engine broke the stillness. Park rangers, alerted by Karen's frantic call, arrived to find Eric near the extinguished fire. His body, broken and bloodied, was surrounded by claw marks and the wreckage of the campsite. The bear was long gone, its trail vanishing into the wilderness it called home. Eric was rushed to the nearest hospital where doctors fought to stabilize him. Though his body bore the brutal marks of the attack, he survived, scarred but alive. For the Johansons, the events of that night would never fade. Karen and the children carried the weight of their helplessness and the image of Eric's selfless courage. The wilderness, once a source of joy and wonder, had become a place marked by tragedy. Eric's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of nature's unforgiving power. Yet, even as he healed, he found himself drawn to the wild. The scars on his body were not just reminders of pain, but symbols of his resolve to protect his family, even in the face of overwhelming danger. The morning air in the wilderness of Wyoming was crisp and filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. Kara Morrison, an experienced solo hiker with years of outdoor adventures under her belt, set out early, her boots crunching against the frost-kissed trail. She reveled in the solitude, feeling as though the forest breathed around her, the towering lodgepole pines standing as silent sentinels. Her pack was well stocked with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and bear spray clipped within easy reach. She knew the risks of hiking alone in bear country, but trusted her knowledge and preparation. The trail wound deeper into the wilderness, and as the sun rose higher, the frost melted into glistening dew. Kara felt invigorated, her muscles humming with the steady rhythm of movement. She noted fresh claw marks on a nearby tree and a patch of disturbed earth, a reminder of whose territory she was in. But she pressed on, her footsteps careful, her senses attuned to the environment. It happened in an instant. As Kara rounded a bend, her gaze caught movement ahead. Just 30 yards from the trail stood a grizzly bear, its hulking frame unmistakable. Two cubs, no more than a few months old, trailed beside it, their playful antics contrasting sharply with the mother's rigid posture. Kara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The bear's dark eyes locked onto her, its body tense. It huffed loudly, a sound that resonated deep in Kara's chest, and stamped its massive front paw. The universal warning was clear. She was too close, and the bear perceived her as a threat to its cubs. Kara knew better than to run. Slowly, she began to back away, her hand moving to the bear spray clipped to her belt. Then, the grizzly charged. The ground seemed to shake as the bear thundered toward her, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Kara fumbled with the bear spray, her fingers trembling as she tried to aim. Just as the bear reached her, she managed to depress the trigger, a cloud of orange mist erupting between them. The bear reared back briefly, its roar deafening, but the deterrent wasn't enough. Driven by maternal instinct and fury, the grizzly lunged through the lingering haze. The impact knocked Kara off her feet. The force of the bear's charge sent her sprawling onto the rocky trail. Pain exploded in her shoulder as she landed hard, the sharp edge of a stone digging into her back. The bear was on her in an instant, its massive paw slashing across her torso. The claws tore through her jacket and into her flesh, leaving deep, ragged gashes that oozed blood. Kara screamed, the sound raw and primal, but there was no one around to hear. She tried to shield herself, her arms coming up instinctively to protect her face. The bear's claws raked across her forearms, shredding her skin and leaving her limbs limp and useless. Blood splattered the ground, bright red against the dirt and leaves. The grizzly bit down on her thigh, its mighty jaws crushing muscle and bone. Kara thrashed beneath it, her survival instincts overriding the agony. She kicked at the bear with her uninjured leg, her boot connecting with its side, but it only seemed to enrage the animal further. The attack was relentless. The grizzly's weight pinned her to the ground, its claws and teeth tearing through her with ruthless efficiency. Her movements grew weaker as blood loss sapped her strength, her vision blurring at the edges. Desperate, she reached for her pack, hoping for anything that could save her, but the bear swatted it aside, scattering its contents across the trail. Kara's body grew still as shock set in, her mind slipping into a haze. The bear, its fury abating, paused its attack. It stood over her, breath hot and heavy, nostrils flaring as it sniffed her motionless form. For a moment it seemed as though it might leave her there, broken but alive. But then one of the cubs mewled from nearby, and the mother turned back to Kara, swiping at her once more with a final, brutal blow that left her chest torn open. Satisfied, the bear lumbered off into the underbrush, its cubs following close behind. The forest fell silent again, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Kara's body lay sprawled on the trail, her blood soaking into the earth. Her once vibrant form was now lifeless, a stark reminder of nature's power and ferocity. The following day, a search and rescue team found her after she failed to check in, raising alarms. They discovered her remains surrounded by scattered belongings. Her pack, bear spray canister, and a trail of blood leading to where the attack had taken place. The claw marks and tracks around her told the story clearly. She had fought valiantly to survive, but the odds had been impossible. News of Kara's death spread quickly, a tragic story that underscored the risks of solo hiking in grizzly territory. Park officials issued stronger warnings advising hikers to travel in groups, avoid areas with recent bear activity, and always carry bear spray. Yet the reality remained. In the wilderness, even the best preparations could not guarantee safety. Kara's family would later describe her as fearless, someone who loved the outdoors and respected its beauty and dangers in equal measure. Her death served as a grim reminder of nature's untamed power, a harsh, unforgiving force that demanded both caution and reverence. As the sun set over the forest's rugged landscape, casting its golden light over the trails, the woods remained indifferent, its cycle of life and death continuing as it always had. The Canadian Rockies were alive with the raw, untamed beauty that had drawn Paul Lafleur back time and time again. A seasoned wildlife photographer, Paul thrived in solitude, where the distractions of human life gave way to the primal rhythms of nature. His battered hiking boots crunched through the frost-dusted forest floor as he ventured deeper into the wilderness, his camera equipment weighing heavily on his back. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the faint musk of pine and damp earth. Paul had been tracking signs for hours. Scattered berry bushes stripped clean, claw marks etched into tree trunks, and patches of flattened grass whispered of a grizzly bear's passage, evidence of a creature that roamed the land with both grace and dominance. It was late autumn, and the bears were in a feeding frenzy before their long hibernation. Paul knew the risks, but had always trusted his instincts and knowledge of bear behavior. By mid-afternoon, he spotted it, A massive, majestic grizzly lumbered through a clearing below. From his perch on a rocky outcrop, Paul watched in awe as the bear foraged, its powerful paws overturning stones in search of insects. Its fur shimmered in the slanted sunlight, a golden brown that blended seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. Paul's fingers worked instinctively, adjusting the lens of his camera and firing off shots. Each click of the shutter felt like a small triumph, capturing moments of wild perfection. Minutes turned into an hour as Paul crouched there, his focus entirely on the bear. He watched it move with deliberate purpose, each action a testament to the raw efficiency of nature. Lost in his craft, he failed to notice when the bear lifted its head, sniffing the air. Its gaze shifted upward, dark eyes locking onto his distant silhouette. A brief pause. Then, without warning, the bear began to move toward him, each step deliberate and unnervingly fast. Paul froze, a cold spike of fear rooting him in place. The bear's gait shifted from a walk to a charge, and instinct took over. He abandoned his camera and sprinted toward the nearest tree, adrenaline surging through his veins and amplifying his every movement. The forest seemed to close in around him, the sound of snapping branches and his ragged breathing filling the air. Reaching a tall pine, Paul leaped at the trunk, his hands scrabbling for a grip on the rough bark. His boots slipped against the damp wood as he pulled himself upward, desperate to gain height before the bear reached him. The tree swayed under his weight, its branches thin and brittle at higher elevations. Below, the grizzly reached the base, slamming into the trunk with a force that made the entire tree shudder. The bear rose onto its hind legs, swiping at the trunk with claws that carved deep gouges into the bark. Paul clung to a branch, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. He had heard stories of bears climbing trees, but had convinced himself it was rare, that most wouldn't bother. Yet this bear was undeterred. It attacked the tree with relentless fury, shaking it violently as if testing Paul's resolve. Then it began to climb. Paul's breath caught as he watched the bear's claws sink into the bark, its immense body following upward. Panic surged through him as he scrambled higher, the branches beneath him bending dangerously. He tried to calculate his next move, but there was no escape. The bear closed the distance with terrifying ease, its eyes fixed on him like a predator with no intention of relenting. A branch cracked beneath Paul's foot, and he slipped, his body lurching downward before he caught himself on another branch. The momentary stumble cost him dearly. The bear surged upward, swiping at him with a paw that struck his leg. Pain shot through him as the claws tore through his flesh, shredding his pants and leaving deep gashes that oozed blood. He cried out, his grip weakening as the bear's other paw swiped again, this time catching his torso. The force of the blow knocked him loose. Paul fell, branches snapping and scraping against his body as he plummeted to the ground. He landed with a sickening thud, the air knocked from his lungs and pain radiating through every inch of him. He tried to move, but his body refused to respond. Before he could even think of crawling away, the bear was upon him. The first bite came with crushing force, the bear's jaws clamping onto his shoulder and shaking him like a rag doll. Paul's scream was guttural, torn from deep within him as the bear's teeth sank deeper. Blood poured from the wound, pooling on the forest floor as the bear released him, only to strike again. Its claws tore into his chest, shredding muscle and bone with horrifying efficiency. Paul's vision blurred, the world around him dissolving into a haze of pain and terror. He tried to fight back, his hands weakly pushing against the bear's massive head, but it was like trying to stop a freight train with a whisper. The bear's growls were deafening, a primal sound that drowned out everything else. Each attack was a calculated display of power, a reminder of the predator's dominance over its domain. The mauling felt endless, but eventually the bear stopped. It stood over Paul's broken body, sniffing him as if to confirm he was no longer a threat. Then, as suddenly as it had charged, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, its massive frame disappearing into the shadows. The clearing fell silent again. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a raven. Paul lay motionless, his body unrecognizable, his life extinguished in the very wilderness he had devoted himself to documenting. Days later, another photographer would find him, his camera lying a few feet away, still intact. The memory card, miraculously untouched, held the final images he had taken. A grizzly bear in all its majestic glory, unaware or perhaps unconcerned that it had become both subject and executioner. The discovery of Paul's remains sent shockwaves through the wildlife community. His death became a rallying cry for stricter safety protocols and renewed debates about the ethics of solo ventures into predator territory. Paul Lafleur had lived for the wild, capturing its beauty and power in ways few others could, but in the end the wilderness he revered had claimed him, a stark reminder of its unforgiving nature. The Chugach Mountains unfolded endlessly before Marcus Reed, a sprawling wilderness of rugged peaks, dense forests, and icy streams. The early morning sunlight filtered through the canopy of towering evergreens, casting golden beams onto the narrow dirt trail that snaked upward. For Marcus, an experienced trail runner and lover of the wild, these solitary excursions were both a test of endurance and a communion with nature's raw beauty. He relished the challenge of remote routes, places few dared to tread, and the sense of peace that came with them. This route, known for its treacherous inclines and isolated stretches, was particularly demanding. The trail twisted through alpine meadows, over rock-strewn passes, and into shadowy thickets where every step required focus. Marcus carried only the essentials: a hydration vest, energy gels, and a small first aid kit. He chose not to carry bear spray, a precaution he had often dismissed as unnecessary. His reasoning was simple. His speed and sharp awareness of his surroundings would be enough. The morning air was crisp. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of Marcus's running shoes on the dirt and the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. His breathing was steady as he tackled the trail's steeper sections, the pounding of his heart in rhythm with the wild pulse of the landscape. The forest around him seemed alive yet tranquil, a shifting mosaic of light and shadow. But Marcus was not alone. Further along the trail, hidden in a thicket of undergrowth, a massive brown bear foraged for food. Its hulking frame moved with quiet power as it stripped berries from low-hanging branches, oblivious to the distant footsteps approaching. The bear was in its element, a dominant presence in the wilderness that Marcus had entered. As Marcus rounded a sharp bend, his sudden appearance shattered the bear's momentary peace. The massive animal froze, its dark, intelligent eyes locking onto the runner. It rose slightly on its hind legs, ears flattening as it assessed the unfamiliar figure. For a split second, neither moved. Then the bear let out a thunderous roar, a primal sound that reverberated through the forest. Marcus's mind raced, trying to recall the advice for such encounters. Don't run, don't panic. But instinct overruled logic. His body reacted before he could think, and he turned and ran, sprinting back down the trail with every ounce of strength he possessed. The uneven terrain that had felt exhilarating moments before now betrayed him, each step threatening to send him sprawling. Behind him, the bear thundered forward, its massive paws shaking the earth as it gave chase. The animal closed the distance in mere seconds. With terrifying speed, it lunged, striking Marcus with a swipe of its paw. The force sent him tumbling to the ground, dirt and debris flying as he landed hard. Pain exploded across his back where the bear's claws had raked deep gashes into his flesh. Disoriented and gasping for breath, Marcus scrambled to rise, but the bear was already upon him. The beast's weight pinned him down, the musky scent of its fur suffocating. Marcus twisted and thrashed beneath it, trying to fend off the relentless assault. His hands scrabbled for anything that could serve as a weapon, finally closing around a jagged rock. He swung upward with desperate force, striking the bear's snout. The impact caused the animal to recoil momentarily, but the reprieve was brief. Enraged, the bear roared and resumed its attack, slamming its claws into Marcus's legs with terrifying precision. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline numbed him just enough to keep fighting. The bear's jaws clamped onto his arm, the sickening crunch of bone echoing in his ears. Marcus screamed, his free hand clawing at the ground as the animal dragged him several feet across the trail. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the dirt a vivid red. Each movement sent new waves of agony through his battered body, but he refused to stop struggling. The bear's ferocity was unrelenting. It tore into his torso, its claws rending flesh from bone. Marcus's screams grew weaker as his body succumbed to the onslaught, his strength draining with every passing second. His vision blurred, the world around him fading into a haze of pain and terror. Finally, the bear paused. Whether satisfied or simply disinterested, it stepped back, its breath heavy and ragged. For a moment it stood over Marcus's motionless form, its dark eyes scanning the trail. Then, without warning, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, vanishing into the shadows as suddenly as it had appeared. The trail fell silent once more. The only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves and the shallow, labored breaths of Marcus as he lay broken and bleeding on the ground. Hours passed before anyone came. A group of hikers stumbled upon the scene, their joyful chatter turning to horrified gasps as they saw the bloodied figure sprawled across the trail. Marcus's body was mangled, his clothes torn, and his gear scattered. The ground around him told the story of a desperate struggle. Claw marks scored deep into the dirt, blood spattered across the rocks and leaves. The hikers acted quickly, calling for help and doing what little they could to stabilize him. Search and rescue teams arrived hours later, airlifting Marcus to a nearby hospital. Against all odds, he survived the attack, though his injuries were catastrophic. Multiple surgeries were needed to mend shattered bones and torn muscles, and the emotional scars ran as deep as the physical ones. The man who had once reveled in the solitude of the wild now bore the weight of its brutality. Wildlife officials launched an investigation into the attack, tracking the bear based on the signs it had left behind. Days later, they located and captured the animal, a large male with a scarred muzzle and blood-stained claws. The decision to euthanize the bear sparked controversy but was deemed necessary to prevent further danger to humans. Marcus's story spread quickly through the outdoor community, igniting debates about safety in the wilderness. Runners and hikers alike were reminded of the risks inherent in venturing into remote areas, no matter how experienced or prepared they believed themselves to be. Many began carrying bear spray or opting for more populated trails, unwilling to take the same risks. For Marcus, the wilderness he had once loved became a source of ambivalence. He carried the scars of that fateful day not only on his body but in his soul. Yet, as he recovered, he found himself drawn back to the mountains, determined to reclaim a part of what he had lost. The Siberian taiga was vast and silent, its endless expanse of snow-covered forest broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. Sergei Volkov, a seasoned hunter, moved with practiced ease through the desolate wilderness. Years of experience had taught him to read the land as one would a book. The faint prints of an elk in the snow, the nibbled branches of a shrub, the distant crack of a twig. It was a brutal landscape, unforgiving to the careless, but Sergei knew its rhythms, its dangers, and its rewards. By mid-afternoon, he had achieved his goal. A large elk lay sprawled in the snow, its lifeless eyes reflecting the cold gray sky. Sergei stood over it, breathing heavily from the effort of the hunt. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, its barrel still warm from the shot that had brought the animal down. He began the laborious process of field dressing the elk, his knife slicing through sinew and muscle, steam rising from the carcass as the frigid air met warm flesh. The scent of blood was thick, clinging to him and saturating the clearing. It was then that Sergei noticed the tracks. At first, he thought they were old, faint impressions in the snow, barely visible in the fading light. But as he studied them more closely, his stomach tightened. The tracks were fresh, large, and unmistakably those of a bear. The realization hit him like a blow. The predator had been nearby, perhaps even watching, drawn by the scent of the kill. Sergei knew the risks. Bears, especially in the late stages of autumn before hibernation, were desperate and unpredictable. A fresh carcass was an irresistible lure, and any animal willing to claim it would not tolerate competition. He quickly packed what he could of the elk, slinging a heavy bundle of meat over his back. He didn't want to linger. The bear's tracks led in the direction he needed to go, forcing him to adjust his route. He decided to climb a ridge to gain both elevation and visibility, hoping to avoid an encounter. The climb was grueling. The snow was deep, and the weight of the elk meat pulled at his shoulders, slowing his pace. The forest around him grew darker as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe with every gust of wind. Sergei's senses were on high alert, his ears straining for any sound beyond the crunch of his boots in the snow. The tracks had disappeared, but he knew better than to assume the bear had moved on. As he neared the top of the ridge, a sudden low growl froze him in place. The sound was deep and guttural, vibrating through the air like a warning. Sergei turned slowly, his breath visible in the cold as he scanned the forest behind him. There it was, A massive brown bear, its silhouette emerging from the shadows like a nightmare given form. Its eyes were fixed on him, black and unwavering, and its body tensed as it prepared to charge. Sergei unslung his rifle in a practiced motion, bringing the weapon to his shoulder as the bear charged. He fired, the crack of the shot echoing through the trees. The bullet struck the bear in its shoulder, staggering it, but the animal didn't stop. If anything, the pain seemed to enrage it further. Sergei quickly chambered another round and fired again, but the uneven terrain and the bear's speed threw off his aim. The second shot grazed its flank, drawing blood but doing little to slow its advance. The bear reached him in seconds. Its massive paw struck him with the force of a freight train, sending him sprawling into the snow. Pain exploded in his chest as claws tore through his coat and into his flesh, raking deep gashes across his torso. Sergei struggled to bring the rifle around, but the bear was relentless. It batted the weapon aside with such force that the stock snapped, leaving him defenseless. Pinned beneath the bear's weight, Sergei fought with a desperation born of sheer survival instinct. His knife was still on his belt, and he managed to pull it free, plunging the blade into the bear's side. The animal roared in fury, its breath hot and foul as it reared back, swiping at Sergei's face with its claws. The blow caught him across the head, splitting his scalp and filling his vision with blood and darkness. The bear bit down on Sergei's shoulder, its mighty jaws crunching through bone. He screamed, the sound muffled by the snow as the bear shook him like a rag doll. His arms flailed weakly, the knife slipping from his grasp as his strength began to fade. The bear's claws raked across his abdomen, tearing through muscle and spilling his insides onto the frozen ground. The snow beneath him turned red, the warmth of his blood melting the icy crust. As the attack continued, Sergei's body went limp. He remained conscious but was fading fast, his vision narrowing to a tunnel as shock set in. The bear seemed to sense his dwindling resistance, its savage mauling slowing as it sniffed at the remnants of its foe. Satisfied, it finally stepped back, its hulking form silhouetted against the darkening sky. With a final grunt, the bear turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Sergei alone in the snow. Days later, the search party found what was left of him. His body lay near the carcass of an elk, mutilated and partially buried under a light dusting of snow. The signs of the struggle were evident: blood-streaked snow, broken branches, and deep gouges in the earth. A few feet away, the rifle lay shattered, its barrel bent and rendered useless. The bear was tracked and euthanized shortly after. Wildlife officials determined that it had been injured but not fatally wounded by Sergei's shots. Its aggression was likely exacerbated by hunger and the scent of the elk. The tragedy sent ripples through the hunting community, a grim reminder of the unforgiving nature of the Siberian wilderness. Sergei Volkov lived for the hunt, mastering tracking and survival in one of Earth's harshest environments. Ultimately, the wilderness he revered claimed him, blurring the line between predator and prey. His death stands as a cautionary tale about the fragile balance between human ambition and nature's raw power. In the whispers of the wind and the crunch of snow, his story lingers, a reminder that even skilled hunters are not invincible. The wilderness, beautiful yet brutal, demands respect and humility, teaching that survival is never guaranteed and that the hunter can quickly become the hunted.